On November 9, 1938, the Nazi Party engaged in a campaign of violence against Jews throughout Germany and Austria, an event that became known as Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass.
Kristallnacht started for us early in the morning. My uncle wanted to close the shutters, leaving the outside world outside. And my grandmother said to him, "Stop that. It's too late. That's not going to protect us."
After 5 years of Nazi rule, hundreds of thousands of Jews were desperate to escape. The problem was, few countries were willing to take in more refugees. Many looked to the United States, but did not yet have immigrant visas. Some hoped that Cuba might offer temporary refuge until their U.S. visas came through. This set the stage for the voyage of the St. Louis.
On May 13, 1939, the St. Louis left Hamburg to go to Cuba, and on board were 937 passengers. The vast majority of these were Jews. This was the beginning of something new, something good. But when they arrived in Havana Harbor, those dreams were kind of shattered.
The Cuban government reversed its policy, invalidating most of the passengers' landing certificates. Only those with valid immigration visas could disembark in Havana.
The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee sent a delegate to Cuba, but the negotiations fell apart, and the St. Louis had to leave Cuban waters. The captain decided that they were going to sail to the United States. They were America-bound anyway, so it was believed that there'd be some flexibility. They sent telegrams to government officials, to President Roosevelt, and to the State Department asking for entry. The State Department stated that though they had waiting numbers to get into the United States, they would have to wait their turn and leave American waters.
By 1938, 1939, public opinion is clearly against Nazi Germany. But that doesn't translate into a willingness to bring in refugees.
Even confronted with specific lives right off the coast of Miami Beach, American public opinion was so against increasing the immigration quota.
Immigrants coming to the United States that might represent a competition for jobs. Bad economic times fueled xenophobia and also fueled anti-Semitism.
No group was more adamantly opposed to admitting Jewish refugees than the German-American Bund. 20,000 members would fill Madison Square Garden on Washington's birthday. They were led by Fritz Kuhn, a German immigrant who fancied himself the American Führer.
What we are actively fighting for under our charter: first, a social, just, white, Gentile-ruled United States. Second, Gentile-controlled labor union, free from Jewish Moscow-directed domination.
Other speakers railed against the president, Frank D. Rosenfeld, and his Jew deal.
We only call upon our leaders to awake to the fact that the Jew is as alien in body, mind, and soul as any other non-Aryan, and that he is 1,000 times more dangerous to us than all the others by reason of his parasitic nature.
A Fortune magazine poll found that only 1 in 10 respondents favored increasing quotas or making exemptions for refugees, and 4 out of 10 believed Jews had too much power in the United States. It further found that 85% of American Protestants and 84% of Catholics opposed offering sanctuary to European refugees. During hearings on the bill to admit some refugee children, a witness said that it should be passed because it was true to the American tradition of providing sanctuary for religious and political refugees. New York Congressman Samuel Dickstein gently corrected him. This is the form of our government, but as a matter of fact, we have never done the things we preach. We talked about it.
So by the end of 1943, there is enough public awareness of the murder of the Jews that the Senate and the House of Representatives issued what is called the Rescue Resolution, calling for a U.S. government agency designed for the relief and rescue of Jews and other persecuted minorities. Simultaneously in the executive branch, a battle was going on between the State Department and the Treasury Department. The Treasury Department, who needed to approve licenses for relief and rescue, realized that the State Department was delaying assisting some of these Jewish aid organizations to send money into Europe.
Treasury Department officials compile a report that is placed before President Roosevelt in January of 1944. And almost immediately, Roosevelt decides on the creation of the War Refugee Board.
The War Refugee Board staff came from the Treasury Department. It was a group who worked with sending money overseas. John Paley, as director of the Foreign Funds Control, became the executive director largely because of the good work that his group was doing.
These were people who were really committed, morally committed, as well as politically committed to saving lives.
The board organizes some relief, but for the most part, they're working through other agencies, streamlining the process. They are able to facilitate sending millions of dollars into Europe and have a much greater impact.
Still, the War Refugee Board confronted a daunting task. The people it hoped to save remained far behind enemy lines, and the board could not divert vital military resources from the Allies' goal of winning the war as soon as possible. Options were very limited.
In the spring of 1944, the War Refugee Board was faced with one of its greatest crises, which was what to do about Hungary.
The Hungarian government had engaged in secret negotiations to leave the Axis. When the Germans found out about this, they sent troops into the country. And along with the troops came Adolf Eichmann's team of deportation specialists.
At the time of the German invasion in March 1944, Hungary was home to the largest Jewish community left in Europe, about 800,000 Jews. Within 2 months, at the request of the Germans, Hungarian authorities began deporting Jews by train to Auschwitz-Birkenau.
President Roosevelt held a news conference in which he warned the Hungarian government not to cooperate with Germany in its persecution. Government shortwave broadcasts to Eastern Europe threatened the Hungarian government that war criminals who cooperated with Germany in mass killings would be prosecuted after the war. This was not enough.
There was a long line of railroad cars, and then order came to mount the cars. And I remember even at 13, I had to help people like my grandmother, people like my aunt, to get up on the high car, and eventually the doors were closed, the locks were put on, and I don't know how many hours wait, and then the trains took off.
And we just couldn't believe that this is possible to transport people like this. It was, of course, standing places only. And there was a small window under the roof and a pail in the corner. It was unbelievable. People became hysterical. They were screaming, some people were yelling, some people were fainting, some people were crying. It was a situation that I never, ever could imagine to happen to human beings.
On July 7, 1944, the Hungarian ruler announced his order to halt the deportations to Auschwitz. A variety of outside pressures, including a U.S. bombing of Budapest on July 2, 1944, influenced his decision. By that time, over 400,000 people had been deported. Hungary's decision to halt the deportations offered the Jews remaining in Budapest a chance to survive, an opportunity the War Refugee Board seized.
There were approximately 120,000 Jews in Budapest in July of 1944. For the moment, they were spared, but no one knew how long they would be spared.
The War Refugee Board petitions and cables to all of the neutral nations of Europe, to Portugal, to Spain, to Switzerland, Sweden, Turkey, and asks them if they could increase their diplomatic representation in Hungary.
Working through diplomatic posts and other intermediaries like the International Red Cross, the War Refugee Board assisted a complex network of rescuers. They employed an array of tactics, from false passports and citizenship papers to safe houses and clandestine escapes. These measures enabled tens of thousands of Jews in Budapest to survive. Unfortunately, by July 1944, over 300,000 Hungarian Jews had already lost their lives.
The anxieties about urbanization, about unlettered, untutored, relatively uneducated peoples coming in large numbers, the sense that disease was a problem, all of these worries were amalgamated into a belief that immigrants cause these problems, and thus immigration should be held down.
Many white Protestant Americans came to fear they were about to be outnumbered and outbred by the newcomers and their offspring, that they were being replaced. They embraced a new pseudoscience born in Britain called eugenics, which falsely claimed, with no evidence, that everything from poverty to prostitution, disabilities to what they called feeble-mindedness, could be eliminated if the individuals they dismissed as socially defective could be stopped from reproducing.
I wish very much that the wrong people could be prevented entirely from breeding. And when the evil nature of these people is sufficiently flagrant, this should be done. Criminals should be sterilized, and feeble-minded persons forbidden to leave offspring behind them. Theodore Roosevelt.
The idea was that the bad people have to stop reproducing, and the good people need to reproduce more. Negative eugenics says sterilize the wrong people, snuff them out. And that's the eugenics that the Nazis would pick up on.
Colleges and universities taught eugenics. Medical societies confirmed it. Clergymen preached it. John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie funded it. And some of the most prominent people in America championed it. Margaret Sanger, Alexander Graham Bell, even Helen Keller.
It seems to me that the simplest, wisest thing to do would be to submit cases like that of the malformed idiot baby to a jury of expert physicians. If the evidence were presented openly and the decisions made public before the death of the child, there would be little danger of mistakes or abuses. We must decide between a fine humanity and a cowardly sentimentalism.
33 of the 48 states would eventually enact eugenics laws mandating the forced sterilization of wards of the state deemed physically or mentally unfit.
The man of the old stock is being crowded out of many country districts by these foreigners, just as he is today being literally driven off the streets of New York City by the swarms of Polish Jews. These immigrants adopt the language of the American. They wear his clothes, they steal his name, and they are beginning to take his women. But they seldom adopt his religion or understand his ideals. And while he's being elbowed out of his own home, the American looks calmly abroad and urges on others the suicidal ethics which are exterminating his own race.
So he publishes a book called The Passing of the Great Race, in which he puts forward the idea that nationalities have eugenic characteristics. He fills it with all sorts of interesting historical so-called data, which is mostly crazy, but it's very persuasive, and it does give the anti-immigration movement, it suddenly gives them science. Science says if we let them in, then they're going to destroy the American gene pool.
For Grant and many others, Jews were a distinct race, not considered white, dismissed as uncouth Asiatics. Grant's supposedly scientific claims about a rigid hierarchy of races was ludicrous. The biological notion of race itself is a fiction. But his ideas caught the imagination of those Americans already opposed to immigration.
People tended to increasingly view nationalities as if they were breeds or species. To liken nationalities to breeds was a fundamental categorical mistake.
Let's turn now to a new crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border as the number of Ukrainians seeking asylum grows by the day. The United States last month committed to accepting as many as 100,000 Ukrainian refugees, but has yet to establish a pathway. So many show up in Mexico, where the Department of Homeland Security has granted a special exemption for Ukrainians to enter the U.S.
Ukrainian men, women, and children eat and sleep on the streets of Tijuana, others in tents.
This is your home for the next few days.
Yeah, that's all what I can bring with me.
But Anastasia Petu couldn't bring her parents, who live outside Kyiv.
You have hope that it will get better there.
Just hope, yeah.
Hope.
And pray.
It's estimated more than 1,000 Ukrainians are camped here, just like thousands of asylum seekers from other countries, mostly Latin American and Caribbean, have done before. But unlike the Ukrainians, a controversial COVID policy known as Title 42 has largely stopped them from going further for the past 2 years. They feel for the Ukrainians, they tell us at this shelter, but Roxana Ruiz Ramirez of Honduras, who's been waiting 9 months to claim asylum, says gang threats have put her family in a life or death situation too.
You need help too. Necesitan ayuda también.
But
U.S.-based corporations like the United Fruit Company, who sourced their goods from lands they owned in Mexico and Central America, got involved in supporting autocrats in the region to protect their bottom line. It's also where we get the term Banana Republic. Going back as far as the 1800s, the Monroe Doctrine sought to end European colonization in the Western world. Later on, President Roosevelt used this doctrine as a way to advance U.S. interests.
Once they gained their independence in the 1820s, then the United States became very interested in making sure that only the United States could intervene politically, economically, in any way.
In 1954, the CIA carried out a coup to oust the sitting president of Guatemala and assist the United Fruit Company's land interests under the guise of the Red Scare from the Soviet Union. Several decades of intervention from the U.S. led to the very issue the region deals with today, such as poverty, corruption, and government instability.
Migrants from the global south are less able to move than those from the global north. These histories of intervention affected the places that people in the modern day are coming from. This explicit intervention beyond the Monroe Doctrine really had a profound impact throughout the world.
The time for a war refugee board would have been before the war, when you really had refugees who were still looking for visas and able in some fashion to get out. If you wait until, in the case of the Holocaust, Hitler begins to expand his Reich across Europe, it's already too late.
I think one of the lessons is that the individual has power. It's public pressure that leads to the rescue resolutions in Congress in the fall of 1943. It's a number of people writing, it's people showing up to protests, it's people saying, I know what's going on in Europe, I believe it, and I want this government to try to stop it.
People want to know, have we learned from history? Have we learned specifically from the history of the Holocaust? And my answer is yes, but we learn very, very slowly.
Terrible things continue to happen. Governments continue to fail to respond sufficiently or soon enough to help victims of genocide around the world. And it's a tough call. There's no easy answer. There are challenges to intervening in a foreign country. There are certainly challenges when you implement a refugee policy that lets a lot of people in at once. And yet we really do need to think about this. When you have millions of people that are left homeless, who are murdered, whose lives are destroyed, those ruins have a ripple effect for every nation on this planet. It carries such a heavy cost that we have a responsibility to figure this one out.